So let me ask this question then. How many of you have read through the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation? Okay, good. And now, how many of you who have read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation have been believers for 10 years or more? Okay, good, good. Now then, let me ask you then, how many have read through the New Testament, Matthew to Revelation? Matthew to Revelation. Okay, good, good. How many have started in Matthew and got through the Gospels? All right, all right. Some of you don't want to put your hands up quite yet. You're kind of wondering where we're going with this. So, then reading the Old Testament, here's another question. How many of you started in Genesis and kind of got bogged down and saying, you know, this is just boring? Come on, be honest, all right? Okay. All right, all right, all right. Good. I just want to know who the honest people are. That's why I asked that question. Now, let's look at the book of Leviticus. How many of you have actually read Leviticus? That's the third book, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Have read Leviticus all the way through. All right, and how many of you are New Testament professors? Okay, our Old Testament professors. So, if I could ask you, what was your experience? How many could say to me, Pastor, man, I was just thrilled reading that book. Grasped my attention and I couldn't wait to read it the next day. No takers on this one, huh? Good, good. Appreciate your honesty there. Because, you know, really this book of Leviticus, and you school teachers might be glad to know that the book of Leviticus was the first book that Jewish children learned in the synagogue. Now, that to me is a smart teacher. You start with the boring first, right? So, because the book of Leviticus had so much to do with how they would live life, and it was teaching them how then could they relate to God, and that's where they began was in the book of Leviticus. Typically today, we would ask somebody who's curious about Christianity to read maybe the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Mark, or even start in the book of 1 John. But rarely would we expect our children to be reading through the book of Leviticus. Maybe we'll change our mind. Who knows? So, in this book of Leviticus, it's a bunch of rituals. But they're rituals for sacrifice. They regulate this matter of clean and unclean. And as we read through that book, we might say, you know, Pastor, that really doesn't have a whole lot to say to us today. And, you know, about 3 weeks ago, I would have agreed with you. But I would totally disagree with you on that point today. You see, we need to ask ourselves a question. We who would call ourselves believers, and by a believer, I would mean someone who believes in Jesus Christ as their Savior. Someone who believes that Jesus Christ paid the penalty for their sin, and today they're resting in the payment that Jesus made on their behalf. That's what I would consider someone as a believer in Jesus Christ. And the thing is, though, how can we as believers who by our own admission don't have an understanding of the sacrificial system, whatever that might be, and we'll find out what the sacrificial system is. But how can we who have no idea what the meaning of the sacrificial system is understand why Jesus had to die? I have a cousin, used to live up in Michigan, came from a very strong Christian family. And on my father's side, actually, he's the son of my father's brother, okay? So, totally an unbeliever. And he said to me this. He said, I think Jesus was an idiot. He missed the boat. He died on the cross, and what for? Why do we have this idea that someone who strings himself up on a cross, whose blood was drained from him, why do we think that that has any effect on our life? Do you know why? Why is it then today, when we come to worship God, there's no blood? Check it out. This is a see-through pulpit. Unheard of in the Old Testament. So why do we get away with such an antiseptic religion? And yet we claim our salvation as being from someone who died a horrific and bloody death on our part. I think we also need to ask ourselves the question about how do we please God? I would imagine that one of the reasons that we have for our behavior as a believer in Jesus Christ is because we want to please God. My question is, how do you please God? And how do you know what you do is pleasing to God? And how can we know what's pleasing to God if we've never read in the book that tells us people how to please Him? Which would be one of the things we'd learn from the book of Leviticus. Now, the other thing I think that we ought to ask ourselves, because there's such a lot of chatter about that today. We came here this morning and we opened up with singing songs and praising. In many churches, and ours would be included, we call that a time of praise and worship. I think the emphasis should necessarily be on the praise. Because in fact, I have to question whether or not we're genuinely worshiping God. It's our practice to call this a worship service. And in calling this a worship service, what we're saying is, we came here for the purpose of worshiping God. But in fact, if we would be honest, we didn't really come to bring anything to worship God. We think that our worship is getting something from God so that we can leave the service today feeling as if it was a good service. It was pretty cool. The singing was great. And we'll find out about the preaching, how that turns out. And so typically, and I'm not making any fault, we're a consumerist society. We're consumers to the core. So that even in our religion and even in our worship, we come to God with a consumer attitude. And so it would be very good for us to ask the question, how can we worship God if we don't know what worship is? And how would we know what worship is if we didn't know what God says to His people about how to come and worship Him? Again, it's in that most boring book we call Leviticus. And so, I suggest to you that we take some time to look at this book, and this is the beginning of a series of sermons. I wish I could tell you how many times it's going to be in this series. I've gone over and over it again, but I can't tell you. So we're just going to have to walk down this road and see where it takes us, shall we? But I will tell you this, that this morning is an introduction. Just an introduction. We're going to kind of take a broad overview of this and look around and bring up some points and then dive into it, hopefully in the next week or so. Now, how we view the book of Leviticus, and in fact is, let's step back, shall we, and to put these things somewhat in perspective. I'd actually like to read the last part of Exodus and then going to the first verse of Leviticus. And if you want to, you can follow along in your Bibles. I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 40 and beginning Exodus 40 beginning with verse 17. In the first month, in the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. Moses erected the tabernacle. He laid its bases and set up its frames and put in its poles and raised up its pillars. Then he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering of the tent over it, as the Lord had commanded Moses. he took the testimony and put it in the ark, and put the poles on the ark, and set the mercy seat above on the ark. And he brought the ark into the tabernacle and set up the veil on the screen, and screened the ark of the testimony as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the table in the tent of meeting on the north side of the tabernacle, outside the veil, and arranged the bread on it before the Lord as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the lampstand in the tent of meeting, opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and set up the lamps before the Lord as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the golden altar in the tent of meeting before the veil and burned fragrant incense on it as the Lord had commanded Moses. And he put in place the screen for the door of the tabernacle, and he set the altar of burnt offering at the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and offered on it the burnt offering and the grain offering as the Lord had commanded Moses. He set the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it for washing, with which Moses and Aaron and his sons washed their hands and their feet. When they went into the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar, they washed as the Lord commanded Moses. And he erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar, and set up the screen of the gate of the court, so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Now, verse 1 of Leviticus reads, "The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say these things," which then he begins to tell in the book of Leviticus, those things he wants his people to understand and know about worshiping him. Now, as we read through this book of Leviticus, we may look at it as simply being a historical narrative. In fact, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, have the benefit of being sequential. In other words, it gives us a linear line of history down through a period of time. Within this linear, sequential history, there are blocks of literature, which we would call priestly literature, in which instructions are given to the priests on how to sacrifice and how to approach God in certain kinds of events and rituals. Now, we can see Leviticus and as this historical narrative and see how an ancient people approached their God with these priestly instructions. And typically then when we read it today as our survey, however unscientific the survey may have been, we find that to be pretty boring. It's just priestly instructions. And so typically our response is, okay, that's cool. That was then, this is now. What does that have to do with us today? Notice that we didn't sacrifice any lambs here this morning. There was no blood spilt. So it seems like there's a far cry between then and now, and typically what we'll do is we'll say, with this historical narrative, that was then. Another view we might take of Leviticus would be to say that every detail about it has something to say about our Christian walk today. So commentators and those who study these books would say they would Christianize it or Gentile-ize it in order to take what was a Jewish ritual and make applications to our life today so that we might find meaning then on how to live our Christian life today in accordance with certain things that were taught in the Old Testament. The problem with that is we tend to lose the original meaning In other words, why did the Jews do this in the first place?